Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Eli Ungar-Sargon, and I'm an independent filmmaker. My first feature-length documentary, Cut, is an exploration of male circumcision and Jewish identity. I made the film because I think that circumcision is a really interesting example of a problem that we don't often discuss openly. Namely, what we, as people who care about living both moral and Jewish lives, are supposed to do when our own ethics conflict with Jewish law. The film will be coming back to New York at the end of September, so if what I say here tonight intrigues you, come up to me afterwards and I'll send you an email with more details about that screening. Infant male circumcision is physically harmful, medically irresponsible, and morally wrong. It is also true that infant circumcision has been a central Jewish practice for thousands of years. I'll come back to the religious side of this issue a little later, but for now, let's focus on the practice divorced from its religious significance. Circumcision is physically harmful because it permanently damages the penis. We now know that the prepuce, or foreskin as it's colloquially known, plays an important role in male sexual experience. In a groundbreaking study published in the British Journal of Urology in 1996, John R. Taylor, a Canadian pathologist, examined the foreskin and discovered a neural structure in its distal ridges that no one had ever seen before. Upon closer examination, the neural structure turned out to be a dense network of sensory nerve endings, the most numerous of which were mechanoreceptors known as Meissner's corpuscles. To get a sense of what Meissner's corpuscles contribute to sensation, we can do a little experiment. Hold up your hand and brush a finger over the back of your hand and the front of your hand. The ticklish sensation that you feel when you brush a finger over the front of your hand is due to the presence of Meissner's corpuscles. There are anywhere from 10 to 20,000 of these nerve endings in the ridged band of the foreskin, making the male foreskin one of the most sensitive parts of the body, right up there with fingertips and lips. Circumcision cuts away the foreskin, and with it, all of the nerve endings of the ridged band, leaving the penis with a much diminished sensory capacity. But beyond the sensory loss, the circumcised penis also loses its motility. In an intact penis, the foreskin glides back and forth over the corona, or head of the penis. During sexual intercourse, this natural gliding action creates a closed system whereby lubrication is conserved. This, in turn, allows comfortable sex to last longer. Moreover, while circumcised men require artificial lubrication to masturbate, intact men have everything they need ready at hand, so to speak. What I have demonstrated thus far is that in the best case scenario, when there are no further complications whatsoever, circumcision causes physical harm. But infant circumcision is also medically irresponsible because it's an unnecessary surgical practice that puts babies at risk. Ask any immunologist or epidemiologist, and they'll tell you that neonates and the elderly are two of the most vulnerable populations to infectious disease. Artificially creating an open wound on an infant is asking for trouble. Precise statistics on circumcision-related complications are difficult to come by in the United States, but a low estimate is 2%. Complications include hemorrhage, sepsis, and in some instances, even death. In the UK, routine infant circumcision was abandoned shortly after World War II, when a comprehensive report found that 16 boys out of every 100,000 were dying of circumcision-related complications annually. A 2002 study published in the Pediatrics Infectious Disease Journal looked back at 25 years of data and found that circumcised Israeli boys had much higher rates of urinary tract infections than intact boys in the United States. These infections peaked in the 9 days following circumcision. Doctors here in the US tend to minimize the risks, and a 2% complication rate might not seem like a lot. But 1.3 million boys were circumcised in this country last year. That's 26,000 complications last year alone. And every year, some unknown number of boys actually die from circumcision. Reading the news in the United States, you'd be forgiven for believing that the jury is still out on the medical benefits of circumcision. The truth of the matter is that there never should have been a jury to begin with. When considering the practice of female genital cutting, we don't start from a neutral position of, I wonder whether there are any health benefits to permanently altering the genitals of baby girls. Let's set up some studies and see what kinds of diseases cutting off clitorises can prevent. We don't do this because we understand the very basic concept that cutting away healthy, functional tissue in the hopes of preventing potential disease is just bad medicine. In fact, the only people in the world who really seem interested in these endless comparative health benefit assessments are people connected to the US medical establishment and their critics, religious apologists, and documentary filmmakers. When I made my film, I went to 3 independent experts, 2 medical doctors and an expert in quantitative analysis. The doctors were people who performed circumcisions regularly, so I wasn't cherry-picking them, and the quantitative expert was a disinterested party who was familiar with the data on circumcision. I asked them what they thought about the health benefits of circumcision. None of them were impressed by the modern data, and they all told me that the evidence was flimsy at best. Which brings us to the ethics of infant circumcision. As pre-autonomous beings, infants are unable to make decisions for themselves, and all decisions related to their bodies are made for them by their parents. Everything from how long their hair is worn, to when to cut their nails, to what sort of vaccinations to give them and how to treat their illnesses. These and many other decisions are made by parents on behalf of their pre-autonomous children every day. Some of these decisions are morally neutral, some are right, and some are wrong. We can all agree, for example, that a parent who refuses to provide their child with antibiotics when they have a bacterial infection is making a morally wrong parenting decision. But some parenting decisions are trickier to judge. Does raising a child with the belief that hell is a real place constitute abuse? How about completely isolating a child from the secular world? Tricky cases indeed. By contrast, infant circumcision is not a tricky case at all. Is it morally permissible for a parent to permanently alter the body and future sexual experience of their child absent absolute medical necessity? No. A non-life-saving, permanent body modification with lifelong consequences is a decision that should be left for a time when the child becomes autonomous and can decide for themselves. Therefore, circumcising male infants is morally wrong. Ladies and gentlemen, I have just argued that infant circumcision is physically harmful, medically irresponsible, and morally wrong. So what do? We're Jews, and we have a conflict. On the one hand, we have the Jewish tradition telling us that we must perform Brit Milah on our 8-day-old sons. On the other hand, we know that the practice of infant circumcision is wrong. As the philosopher Andy Pessin recently argued in the Huffington Post, there are 3 logical paths you can take when this sort of a conflict of values arises. First, you can simply abandon the religion entirely. Second, you can ignore the ethical problems and get on with practicing your religion in spite of them. And third, you can try to move the religion forward. I've clearly chosen the third option. For some reason that I hope to learn tonight, Rabbi Boteach has decided to pretend that there is no conflict. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, I apologize for my laptop being open, but having arrived here late, I did not have an opportunity to print some of the statistics that I quoted in some recent articles that I published on the subject. I'm not surprised that Eli concluded his presentation by asserting that I am engaging in an act of fraudulence and pretension in falsely displaying ethics to be not in conflict with circumcision. By using that line, and by personalizing the debate so early, before I have even had an opportunity to respond, you are seeing a manifestation of what this debate about circumcision really is. It is not a debate about fact. It is not a debate about medical or health benefits. It is quite simply a radical secular assault on faith. It's easy to prove this, unfortunately, because the only reason we're having this debate is that for the first time, a referendum on circumcision has reached a plebiscite in San Francisco. It has actually reached a ballot. We Jews were accustomed to this happening in previous generations in very anti-Semitic countries, and it continues to happen in Europe. We have never been accustomed to seeing it here in the United States. I wanted to debate the actual proponent of the referendum, who I debated on CNN. He refused, and Eli got in touch, and thank you very much for being here this evening. I know it wasn't easy to come, and I'm grateful. But this is what this campaign is about. One of the main proponents of the circumcision ban, this is his cartoon, Foreskin Man. I like the way the rabbis look a little bit devilish, one might even say satanic. But the best is where you read the line, "Where is the child?" The radical attempt to portray religion as monstrous, barbaric, irrational, inhuman, and of course, the age-old bar opposed to sexuality, is so time-worn as to be almost yawn-inducing, but it is making a very strong recurrence in our time. Therefore, I also could have predicted that Eli would immediately discuss the unfactual argument that circumcision desensitizes the human penis. For the record, let me say that no religion on earth celebrates sexuality more than Judaism. I wrote a book called Kosher Sex. I'm sorry that I cannot go through all the material now to demonstrate that. But the comparison of circumcision to clitoridectomy is so absurd as to be perverse. Clitoridectomy is designed for one purpose and one purpose only: to ensure that a woman never enjoys sex. Whereas circumcision is designed for one purpose only, and that is to teach a child, a male child, from the earliest age that his sexuality can be hallowed, sanctified, and consecrated. How many more sexual scandals will we read involving men who have never learned that message, who believe that sexuality ought to be an indulgence? I find it interesting that Eli celebrates the work of people like Richard Dawkins, or my friend Christopher Hitchens, or Daniel Dennett. Richard Dawkins, who I debated in Oxford, doesn't really even believe in human love. For him, sexuality is about the propagation of the species, love being nothing but a trick played upon us by our genes in order to guarantee the widest possible distribution of the gene pool. Sexuality has an almost animalistic characteristic to it. Men are not expected to control themselves, and we dare not even judge their sexual immorality like betraying the wives to whom they made a commitment, because they are not designed to control themselves. Judaism thinks differently. How absurd to argue that circumcision denies sensual sensitivity. I'm not a doctor. I will cite some studies and statistics. Eli's not a doctor either. But the absurdity of the argument is that you're talking about the one community whose longevity throughout history has been proven because they emphasize loving sexual congress between a man and a woman. You're talking about the one religion that says that a man cannot enjoy sex if his wife doesn't enjoy it first. You're talking about the only religion on earth that made it obligatory upon a man to sexually satisfy his wife. And here we have comparisons between circumcision and clitoridectomies, which is a barbaric ritual designed to remove any sexual enjoyment or pleasure on the part of a woman. I can't debate whether the foreskin gives you greater sexual pleasure or not. I have never had one. It's beyond the scope of this debate, because I do know that men who are circumcised, representing the vast majority of American men, seem to enjoy sex pretty darn well. If there is no great crisis in America among Jewish men who complain, you know, my penis just doesn't feel enough today. If only I had even more sensitivity in that region of my body. It seems to me that the crisis in our culture is precisely the opposite. Men not being able to control their sexuality. And no religion on earth has ever said that as part of God's covenant, the covenant is on a sexual organ. Talk about being counterintuitive. Every other religion denigrates sexuality. Mary is a virgin who has never had sexual congress. The Catholics believe that even after she had Jesus, she remained a lifelong virgin, which is why they deny that James is the brother of Jesus, although it says it outright in the New Testament. How many other cults had virgin births? Because sexuality was something dirty, something forlorn, something carnal, something animalistic, but not Judaism. What an incredible statement that a religion would say that the covenant of God is found specifically on a man's ability to love and pleasure a woman. So that male sexuality, which has sometimes been so unsanctified, can be raised to a higher plane. We can, if we wish, debate the medical benefits of circumcision this evening. I'm sorry. My own computer's not letting me in. Sorry. But I've researched this pretty extensively. It's probably more appropriate for true experts to debate this side of the subject. But if you look at the extensive studies that have been published in the British Medical Journal, you will discover that, number one, I remember this headline, I'm sure many of you do, headline of the New York Times a few years ago that was a bombshell, that circumcision, aside from a condom, is the most effective means by which to prevent the transmission of HIV/AIDS. We could almost contain the plague of AIDS in Africa, something I saw with my own eyes. When I was in Zimbabwe recently, 22, 23-year-old men, an entire generation were wiped out from AIDS. I helped to feed, I should say, the Christian relief organization called Rock of Africa, a mud hut village on Thanksgiving Day, 2009. We bought 17 goats, had them slaughtered so they could have meat. And it was all grandparents who were raising these children. There was no middle generation. They had all died from HIV/AIDS. We could almost contain that plague if those men who were circumcised. In fact, my friend Rabbi Shmuley Boteach, who runs the Fellowship of Christians and Jews, wanted to pay for rabbis, hundreds of them, to go together through Africa circumcising the men in order to contain the plague. Circumcision has been proven as the most effective means by which to stop the transmission of HIV/AIDS. The British Medical Journal reporting that circumcised men are 8 times less likely to contract the infection. Circumcision removes what are called Langerhans cells that exist in the foreskin. They exist in the foreskin, which makes the foreskin susceptible to HIV. You see, Langerhans cells have special receptors that may grant the virus access into the body. Circumcision also significantly reduces the transmission of other STDs like genital herpes, syphilis. It reduces the risk of urinary tract infection for men. And men who are circumcised have 100% immunity from contracting penile cancer, which, though rare, is obviously best avoided completely. Male circumcision is especially healthy for women. It significantly reduces the risk of cervical cancer by at least 20%, according to the British Medical Journal. Cancer of the cervix in women is due primarily to the human papillomavirus. The virus thrives under and on the foreskin, from where it can be transmitted during intercourse. But in the final analysis, ladies and gentlemen, the proof that this entire effort to demonize circumcision is nothing but an attempt to demonize religion at large with anything they can find is that no one ever came to them complaining, asking them to be advocates. Where are the women who came forward and said, can you please advocate that men stop being circumcised? We don't feel that our husbands are getting enough sexual satisfaction. I will tell you what's destroying marital sex. This is an area where I claim some expertise. I've written many books on the subject. 1 out of 3 American marriages is entirely sexless. It was the subject of my book, The Kosher Sutra, which thank God was a national bestseller. The principal reason? Pornography on the internet and masturbation, where men do not feel that their wives are their principal sexual outlet. The denigration of sex so that it's no longer something fascinating and interesting. Its widespread availability in the form of things that degrade it so that it loses its mystery. I've debated some of the world's leading relationship experts on these subjects. No one ever said that circumcised men have worse sex. They have said that husbands who lose romantic interest in their wives, or who cheat on their wives, or who make their wives feel unloved, who don't focus on them, that's where sex begins to disappear. So if the opponents of circumcision were truly interested in the sexual vitality of men and women, they would know where to go. They would teach teenagers, and especially young girls, that you have sex at 14 and 15 in order to accommodate some 16-year-old in high school who made you feel like if you say no, I won't be your boyfriend anymore, that's not a pleasurable sexual experience. 80% of women, they report that their first sexual experience is not pleasurable. It starts to turn them off sex. It's not a loving act. It's about feeling used at times. That's what turns people off of sex. But you don't see them attacking that aspect of the culture. The secular aspect of the culture that has demeaned and degraded women. The aspect of the culture that has erased the line that divides the female recording industry legitimately. People like Aretha Franklin, from what has simply become soft porn, beginning with Madonna, continuing with Britney Spears, continuing with Lady Gaga. Did the Beatles need to run around in stiletto heels and tights in order to sell their albums? You show me one woman who, besides Susan Boyle, always used as an example, who actually has some flesh on her who can sell an album. The disgusting sexual exploitation of women, which is part and parcel of a secular culture that sees women's bodies as nothing but the means by which to sell beer during football games. That's what's making men disrespect women. We once had a dream, and I'm a feminist. We had a dream. We once had a dream that a woman would be appreciated for her brain and not her bust. There are maybe 3 or 4 women in America who are famous for their brains. Hillary Clinton, Oprah Winfrey, Diane Sawyer, Kitty Kirk. You know how many are famous for their bodies? I can't count them all. I've not allotted that much time in this debate. And if people really cared about the death of sexuality, and how men don't respect women sexually, which is turning women off of sex, because I counsel these people every day, their target would not be religion. It would be radical secularism.
Well, I don't really know where to begin. But maybe I should start with apologizing for the fact that my name isn't Lloyd Schofield or Matthew Hess. I am not those people, and I'm not here to defend them. I'm here to debate the practice of circumcision. Matthew Hess is the author of the Foreskin Man comic, and Lloyd Schofield is the proponent for the ballot in San Francisco, ballot initiative. I'm not them, and I don't even know if my arguments are the exact same arguments that they make. But more to the point, let me try and address a few issues here that I think are really important to keep straight. First of all, on the issue of male versus female genital cutting, it's important to note that there are a variety of female genital cutting practices throughout the world, and there are a variety of male genital cutting practices throughout the world. And they vary in severity. And I think what the rabbi is making a mistake about here is the rationale for a practice versus the effects of a practice. In other words, I could cite to you Jewish sources that claim that the purpose of circumcision is to reduce sexual pleasure, such as the Rambam and Mon Nevuchim, for example. Gersonides around the same time. Most of them are sort of clustered around the medieval period, which is not surprising. But that has to be taken as a separate issue. Why a practice is justified, or what reasons are given for a practice, as opposed to what the effects of a practice are. And that brings me to another point that I'm a little puzzled by, because if the foreskin is beyond the scope of this debate, then I don't really know what we're talking about anymore. Because circumcision is about cutting away the foreskin. And if you want to know if something is being lost, you need to talk about what the foreskin does for an intact male. So that seems to be a problem right there. I would take you to task on the issue of men not complaining about their circumcisions. There are hundreds of thousands of men around the world who have gone through a very painful process of restoration. That's a sort of extreme. That's you're so upset about circumcision that you are going to stretch the remnant of your foreskin so that you can feel better about it. And there are hundreds of thousands of men who do that. There are also lots of men who suffer from some of the complications that I mentioned earlier. So the notion that no one complains about circumcision is just patently and demonstrably false. I don't think you have to argue, coming back to the previous point, I don't think you have to argue that Judaism is against sexuality, or that Judaism rationalizes the practice of circumcision as a decrease in sexuality to decide whether or not this is a harmful practice. And I mean, as far as, the evidence for what I was saying about the Meissner's corpuscles in the foreskin, it was discovered by Taylor in the 90s, as I mentioned. It's been reconfirmed by Hyang et al. In 2005, and I'm not making this up. There's a researcher named Dong. Dong et al. In 2007 also confirmed the existence of this high concentration of Meissner's corpuscles in the ridge band of the foreskin. And it's been neurologically confirmed by Sorrells et al. In their 2007 BJU study. There were too many health claims for me to go through every single one. We can do that in the Q&A if you'd like, but I do want to point something out about the history of circumcision as a medical practice in the United States. It has a profile of being a cure in search of a disease. So if you look back, and it's really interesting also because circumcision proponents often sort of combine this history as, well, we do circumcision because of cervical cancer, because of urinary tract infections, because of HIV. And the truth of the matter is that actually, you need to look at the history. Every generation since the early 20th century has given a different reason for why circumcision is practiced. And another piece of very important evidence is if you look at the number of studies devoted to male genital cutting and its health benefits, so-called, and the number of studies devoted to these, if there are any, health benefits of female genital cutting, you'll understand that this is a cultural practice that the United States is trying to justify over and over and over. So just the historical profile alone makes this whole thing very, very suspicious. Any other points? Yeah, just on this issue of me celebrating Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, I assume that is a reference to a podcast I did a few years back called Holy Atheism. But I'm guessing the rabbi didn't listen to the episodes, because I was very critical of all of those thinkers in my podcast and in the reading groups, and there's someone here who was a part of those reading groups who can testify to that. So thank you.
Thank you. The very first act of corruption of mankind took place through a corruption of language. when the serpent says to Eve, isn't that a good fruit? Not a luscious fruit, not a delectable fruit, but a good fruit. He discombobulates her through a corruption of language. A fruit can be tasty or tasteless, but moral terms do not apply to it. You will notice that very often when people make an assault against religion, they employ the same corruption of language. What Eli would have us believe is a circular argument based on that corruption of language. For him, circumcision is automatically a form of genital mutilation, genital cutting. Once he's embedded that phrase in your mind, he then can extend it and say, should a parent be allowed to engage in an act of mutilation? I could attempt the same thing. I could tell you that piercing a little baby girl's ears is an act of mutilation. And once I have you accept that, then we can extend it to say, who am I to make that decision? Now, of course, I'm not making the comparison between the two, other than to say, the only time we can question whether a parent can make that decision is once we accept it's a form of cutting and mutilation. What do you really believe has a bigger impact on a child's mental and psychological stability? Whether his parents are married or divorced, or whether he's circumcised? I have counseled thousands of people in my time. I have yet to meet one of these legions of men who seek counseling because they don't have a foreskin. I have yet to receive a single phone call or an email from any man who says, I need to see you, Shmuley, I don't have a foreskin. But I have met many, many men who are deeply psychologically scarred by the fact that their parents are not together, or are not together when they grew up. I was one of those children, and I still am. Should we stop parents from divorcing because of the unbelievable trauma to which it subjects a child, as has just been proven yet again in the landmark study published 2 weeks ago that grabbed headlines? Should we stop women from adopting, knowing full well that these days, almost the majority, and this is not scientific, but I can only say from my experience, children that are adopted later, and this didn't happen a few decades ago, they're all seeking their biological parents. How traumatic is that to discover that mom and dad are not exactly mom and dad? That's a pretty big decision. Should we stop adoption? I would say that's a more serious decision than whether or not you're going to circumcise a boy. I would even say that the decision as to whether or not to have a child is a bigger decision. Who are we to decide for our children that they should have to live? Do you know life is filled with a lot of pain? Some might even argue it has more pain than pleasure. And sometimes it has more heartbreak than romance, more disappointments than blessings. And it always ends in tragedy and death. It's inescapable. Who are we to decide to even have a child in the first place? When I compared you, with all due respect, Eli, to Richard Dawkins, it is not because I believe you endorse his views, but you are mouthing his famous critique that parents who raise their children in religion are guilty of abuse. He thinks they should even perhaps be prosecuted. It's the same kind of argument. You've made this decision to circumcise your child. Well, let me tell you, I made that decision for 3 of my sons, and I am absolutely proud of it. When they were born, they were brought into the covenant of Abraham. They were brought into the covenant of a people who believe that sexuality is not something that cannot be controlled. They were brought into the covenant of a people who believe that love involves honorable action, fidelity, and commitment. It is no mystery that Jewish families and communities are so incredibly strong, universally acknowledged as such, because of that commitment on the part of men to be domesticated at an early age and to be devoted to one woman, all of which stems from the brilliant spiritual psychology of circumcision. That on your male member can be a mitzvah. On the contrary, it is the separation of ethics and sexuality that has led to the morass we are now in. Whether it's books like The Moral Animal that argue that we should no longer be censuring infidelity in marriage because it's absolutely natural. There is nothing more natural. Monogamy is not natural. The New York Times magazine did a cover story 2 weeks ago, and I responded to Huffington Post. I wish I could have responded to the New York Times. One of the most absurd, ridiculous cover stories I've ever seen. The New York Times of a gay sex therapist. Can someone remind me his name? I'm sorry, I don't recall his name.
Dan Savage.
Dan Savage, thank you very much. Who argues that monogamy should be monogamish. That we should accept that there should be an incomplete commitment to fidelity in marriage because people are always going to cheat a little bit instead of disappointing each other with more stories like Elliot Spitzer or Anthony Weiner. Let's just accept it from the beginning. Fascinating argument. If not for the fact that it's been so repeated and rehearsed, that was, again, yawn-inducing. The greatest British thinker, arguably, of the 20th century was Bertrand Russell. He was the world's greatest proponent of open marriages. He and his wife had that agreement. And he wrote his wife long letters about how he would seduce the housekeeper, how he would endlessly unfurl his tongue down her esophagus. He didn't expect any kind of control. And I assume he was not circumcised, neither of penis nor of heart. But when his wife got pregnant by another man, he quickly divorced her and he said, the expectations I was making of myself did not live up to the kind of natural jealousy that can ensue. You want to try to create monogamish? Get the women to agree. Guys might be for it, but you get me the women to agree. I was not surprised that it was a man writing a story about a man in that cover story. I am the ear to the wives who live with men with wandering eyes or uncontrollable sexuality, flirting outrageously, even if they don't actually commit adultery. I'm the one to whom women come when they find a mountain of porn on their husband's laptops. And you know what it makes them feel? Ordinary. Absolutely ordinary. So ordinary that they cannot even sustain the attraction of their own husbands. Would it were, the reason why I welcome this evening is it allows us to finally focus on the ethical obligations inherent in circumcision. It cannot be only and simply an empty ritual. A vacuous religious practice. It must remind men of all times of what its purpose is. And for God's sake, if we continue to have more stories like Arnold Schwarzenegger, more stories like Dominique Strauss-Kahn, whatever happened then, and more women are going to use the 4 women of Sex and the City as role models, simply to believe that we can have sex with men. We can long for men, yearn for men, lust for men, but we can never really connect with men because they're in a different wavelength. Because what we're looking for is not what they're looking for. We're looking for one man to place us at the center of his world and make us feel like we are special forever. And he's looking for a woman, part-time, as a principal partner, but with whom he can fool around and have others, and women are not going to sign up for that. Let me finally say, my friends, there's a terrible crisis in our culture right now. Women are being weaned off of men. It's never happened before, but it's happening now. 1/3 of women 35 and over are single. They're married to their careers. They find greater satisfaction from their jobs than they do from their relationships. 3/4 of all divorces today are initiated by women, something we never would have expected. Because we've always been led to believe that a woman doesn't want to be alone. That she's prepared to even endure a lonely marriage for the sake of her children, or because, the famous statistic, women 35 and over in America have a greater likelihood, this is Gloria Steinem's statistic, of being in a terror attack They're never finding a husband. And yet they are leaving their husbands in droves because they're tired of the statistics that show that 1 in 4 men is a porn addict, defined as looking at porn for an hour a day. This laptop is filled with emails from men who write to me about these problems, asking me how to be, or the wives. We need to change things. We need to teach men what circumcision means. And it means that your sexuality can be hallowed and sanctified. And I do want to make one challenge to you, Ellie, if you will please forgive me. You said that you know scores and scores of men who have had restorative therapy.
No of.
Okay, you said you know of scores of men. So I have one challenge for you. You're an expert in this field because you did a documentary on it. I did not. I claim no expertise in this in particular. Sexuality, maybe perhaps more, God willing. I've written many books on that subject. But here's my simple challenge. Please name the URL of the website where these men have gotten together to complain about the fact that they don't have a foreskin.
www.norm.org, I think it is. N-O-R-M.
You think or you know?
I don't know if it's org or com, I'm sorry, but if you Google N-O-R-M, you can look it up right now.
And how many men are on that website complaining they don't have foreskins?
There are support groups all over the country.
Okay, because I know of virtually every advocacy group in the United States. I know people who advocate for healthy living, healthier food, against pedophiles, child predators. This has yet, to my knowledge, really, excuse the pun, penetrated the media. So if these men really do exist, and they're very tortured about the fact that they don't have a foreskin, my gosh, they're kind of silent about it, or they need a new PR agent.